And so this morning we're going to be diving in to a couple of Jesus' parables in Matthew. We have been in this series on adulting, right? Talking about what does it mean to be an adult. And we've been working with this definition of doing what you don't want to do because later you will be thankful you did it, especially mundane, everyday tasks. And we're going to be reading this morning just a few verses, but powerful verses, in Matthew chapter 13. We're going to be in Matthew 13, verses 31 to 33. And it says this: He, that is Jesus, presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and mixed into 50 pounds of flour until all of it was leavened. This is actually our final week in this adulting series, and excited to dive into these verses. I've titled this message, Resilient Hope. Resilient Hope. I feel like we could all use some hope right now. The time that we live in, or even coming to the end of this series on adulting, we need hope for adulting, right? We're going to be talking about resilient hope. I have 3 points for you this morning: small beginnings, slow rise, and building for the kingdom. Would you all join me in prayer? Father, you are great, and yet you choose to commune and relate with us. Lord, who is man? Who are we that you are mindful of us, that you would send your Son to die for us? And yet, Lord, you call us your sons and your daughters and heirs in your kingdom. God, you made us in your image, and Lord, I just pray that you would speak through me today as your son, your image bearer, knowing, God, that my own thoughts and my own words are pretty feeble, yet your word is powerful and sharp. And Lord, I pray that it would penetrate hearts today, Lord, that your truth would be made evident, Lord, that you would fill us with hope as we hear from your word. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so before we kind of get into the details of these two parables of Jesus, I thought it might be helpful to first ask, why parables? First of all, what is a parable? Well, simply a parable was something that Jesus used. It was a fictional story, and although it was fictional, it pointed to a greater truth. It pointed to something much deeper. But why did Jesus choose to use parables? Why didn't he just flat out just say what he meant? And I think there's 2 reasons why. I mean, the first, I think we can all relate to this, is that story is everything. Story is such a part of who we are as human beings. We look at everything. We look at our lives through the lens of story. We tell stories through books, through plays, through essays, movies, photographs, songs. The one that's been on repeat in our house is We Don't Talk About Bruno. I apologize if that's going to be stuck in your head for the rest of this message, but why? Why is a song like that so popular? I mean, A, it's crazy catchy, but B, in those 3 minutes, it tells a story. We gravitate to stories, right? We use metaphors like turning the page or starting a new chapter, talking about our own personal narrative, or let me tell you my side of the story, right? Because story gets to the root of what it means to be human. As I was thinking about how story works and the structure of story and what it means, I turned to the experts. Pixar. I mean, has there ever been a bad Pixar movie? I mean, those guys know what they're doing. They know how to tell stories. And they have actually come up with what they call their 22 rules of storytelling. So they have managed to find a structure of 22 rules in every movie that they make. As they storyboard it and they talk about the plot, it flows through these 22 rules. I think what that shows us is story is a lot more complex usually than what we see on the surface, right? I mean, the best stories are the ones that we can keep coming back to and keep coming back to, because the farther in we go, the deeper they get. Those are the best stories. Pete Docter, who is one of the original directors at Pixar, said this. He said, "The power of story is that it has an ability to connect with people on an emotional level." It's that emotional level, right, that draws us in. And I think we see that in Jesus' use of story, his use of parables, in speaking to us. It's showing us how Jesus is, while he's the Son of God and fully God, he's also fully human, and he understands, he feels human emotions, and he communicates on an emotional level as well. And there's a second purpose of why Jesus chose to speak to us, speak to his audience in parables. And that is to hide or reveal truth. Hide or reveal truth. His disciples actually asked him at one point that same question, why? Why do you speak to the people in parables? And this is what he said in Matthew, same chapter, Matthew 13, just a little bit earlier, verses 10 to 11. His disciples say, "Why are you speaking to them in parables?" And Jesus answered, "Because the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given for you to know, but it has not been given to them." That's a little hard to process, isn't it? It sounds a little harsh. And later on he says, "Blessed are your eyes because they do see, and your ears because they do hear." I think the key phrase in there, the secrets of the kingdom have been given for you to know, right? Have been given. This isn't something that the audience went and extracted on their own or used their own intellect. This was God's revelation to his people, God's revelation to those whom he chooses. So Jesus was doing two things simultaneously through these very simple stories. One, he was revealing divine truth, revealing it to those whose hearts were soft, who were open to receiving it, who were believing the mysterious. You know, this is an example of God's grace in softening people's hearts to receive this. But at the same time, he was also concealing truth from those whose hearts were hardened, those who were denying the obvious being Jesus' miracles, his signs, his healings, his teachings. Those whose hearts were hardened and denying the obvious and the obvious implications of what this meant and what it said about who Jesus was, which was the Son of God. So he's revealing and concealing at the same time. The concealing is evidence of God's judgment. So with that quick background on parables, let's go ahead and jump into this first parable. Let's jump into the text. Point one, small beginnings. So the kingdom of heaven, Jesus said, is like a mustard seed. A man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants, becomes a tree so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. There's this thing that's, I think, growing in popularity. It's been around for a while. It's called a gap year. Are you guys familiar with a gap year? Has anyone ever done a gap year? It's this concept of between high school and college, or between college and your career job, you take a year off and go backpacking in Europe, or I don't know, I think that's all people do is go backpacking. Maybe there's other things they do. I too had a gap year. And I graduated right about the time of the Great Recession. Those of you who graduated about that time know how hard it was to find jobs. But in my case, my gap year was covering the gap between what was in my bank account and what Sally Mae said I needed to pay on my student loans. And so my parents made it very clear that this gap needed to be filled with some kind of employment. You know, they didn't care if it was my career position yet, but the bills were coming due, all right, and I needed to find something. So I ended up working in lawn care up there. This is up north, middle of the summer, not as bad as Florida, but still pretty hot. I knew nothing about yard care. I mean, I knew kind of the general concept was there was grass and you took care of it, but that was about it. But with a little bit of training, they put me in a van, they sent me out, kind of learning on the spot. And one of the primary things that we did for customers' homes was seeding. So we would do fertilizing and weed control and things like that. But we'd come out to these homes and fill up my machine with all this grass seed, these tiny little seeds, and we'd go and we'd spread them over the bare patches of the lawn. And I just remember thinking after doing my first few houses, I looked back, and other than the little flag I had stuck in the lawn, there was absolutely no indication that I had done anything. There was no gratification in that whatsoever. It's not like mowing where you can kind of see and the customer says, hey, you did a good job. There was no gratification in that. So it was a frustrating start to that mini career there. Until a couple months later when I got assigned to the same homes. And I went back out there. And what do you think I saw when I went back out there? Suddenly, these bare patches had these little shoots that were coming up and sprouting. I'm like, okay, maybe I did do something after all. Maybe I did something right. And you go back out to these houses after weeks or after months, and before you knew it, some of these homes where there were bare patches or dirt lawns had these beautiful carpets of grass. When I say grass, this is real grass. This is up north. It's not like this like green sandpaper stuff that we call grass down here. This is the stuff you actually want to walk on in your bare feet. But you'd see all this new growth. But it took what to see that? It took time. It took time. It didn't happen right away. And so putting ourselves in the footsteps, in the shoes of Jesus' audience at the time, the Jewish people, by the time Jesus shows up on the scene, they have been waiting. They have been waiting and waiting. There had been about 400 years since the time of the last prophecy in the Old Testament to the time Jesus shows up, those called the 400 silent years. And they had not been very enjoyable years for the Jewish people. They were conquered by the Greeks, and then by the Egyptians, and then by the Syrians, and finally by the Romans. 4 different occupations, and they have been waiting for this Messiah, this prophesied Messiah that's going to come in and deliver them and lead them to freedom, and in their minds liberate them from this Roman occupation and oppression. And so here Jesus is telling these parables about the kingdom, and you can imagine their ears are perking up as he starts to talk about this kingdom. Okay, what is this he's talking about? You've got our attention. And what does Jesus say? Well, first of all, the good news. The wait is over. Jesus tells them the kingdom of heaven is. It's present tense. Okay, that's exciting, right? There must be something going on now. The kingdom of heaven is. This is what we've been wanting to hear. But then he keeps going, and he compares it to what? A mustard seed. Probably not the analogy you were hoping for. You know, I'm not sure what trees grow in this region, but if I'm in their shoes, I'm hoping for, an oak, one of those like California redwoods. Like that's what we want coming in as the kingdom, like, poof, just crushing Rome. He compares it to a mustard seed. So Jesus is saying, the kingdom is, there's a present reality here, but he's also telling them what it will become. When grown, it will be a tree. So there's this present reality, but there's also this future realization. And Jesus is also telling them, look around as he's sitting there with his disciples and his audience, and he's saying, essentially, this is the kingdom. This is where we're starting. And the disciples at that point must have been thinking, what, really? Maybe a little underwhelmed, like we're lacking resources, we're lacking education, we don't have any political power or clout. And yet, it's from these seemingly insignificant beginnings that a kingdom is going to come too great in number to count. I want to look back real quick in Genesis. In Genesis 22, God makes an appearance to Abraham, and he makes him a promise. Now, what does that have to do with the kingdom? Well, we'll see in just a second. But Essentially, God shows up and he tells Abraham, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And I can imagine Abraham, kind of like the disciples hearing Jesus, felt similar feelings. He's looking around, it's just him and Sarah, thinking, all right, we've got no kids, my wife is barren, we've got a couple hundred years combined experience between us. You're going to do what now? And yet we see God fulfill that promise through the line of Abraham, all the way up until the coming of Jesus. And yet the beautiful thing is Jesus is saying that's not the end of it. That's not the extent of it. We're seeing God's promise continue through Jesus. And in Galatians, Paul tells us, understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham. Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announced the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. And I love seeing this because you see the connection between the promise in the Old Testament and then Jesus coming and saying he's a fulfillment of that promise. But look, I'm promising even more. When God told Abraham that his descendants would outnumber the stars, we're seeing too now how, as Jesus is coming and sharing about the kingdom, he's promising the same thing. It's expanding even more. It's growing even more than Abraham could ever have imagined. Growing from a seed to a tree. And the parable says that it becomes a great tree so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. I love that ending that Jesus put on there, the vision and the image of the birds in the sky coming and nesting. The kingdom is not just this self-serving thing. It's a place for all people, from every tribe, every nation, can come and find nourishment, can come and find rest, can come and find an eternal home. That's the symbolism of the birds coming and into the branches of the tree. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds great. Story is great, metaphor is great. What does this actually mean? So I want to tell you about two things that might seem like they have no relation whatsoever. One is an evangelistic program in London, and the other is an infrastructure program in China. So many years ago, China started rolling out what they call their Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know if you've got, nope. All right. You're just going to have to take my word for it because I had a really impressive map. I like maps, so this is my excuse to finally work one into a sermon. Belt and Road Initiative, and basically this was China's foreign policy of building global infrastructure. Their idea was to build global infrastructure of roads and networks of sea lanes and railroad tracks all around the world to help with their importing and exporting and grow their influence. And one of the places that China is investing heavily is in Africa. And they're estimating there's somewhere around 1 million Chinese workers abroad right now building as part of this program, this initiative. Meanwhile, in the UK, there's an organization called Alpha. They've been around for a little while, but they created these evangelistic programs to help churches break into the cities and have conversations around faith with people that might never set foot into a church building. Well, Alpha is contacted by churches in Kenya, in East Africa. And the Kenyans say, hey, we have the program in our language. It's working great. We love it. But could you think you could translate it into Mandarin? And you have to be wondering, if you're the British, okay, why is an African country contacting a British organization, asking them to translate their program into Mandarin? Well, what's been happening is as these Chinese migrant workers are coming and working, they are encountering Christians. They are running into churches, and Kenya has a lot of churches. And so they're there working, they're encountering Christians, they're being invited to church, they're being invited to this Alpha program, they're coming to faith. And so the Kenyans are now saying, we need something in Mandarin so that we can share the gospel with the Chinese who are in our country. I think that's incredible. And one of the best parts about that is these Chinese workers, when the work is completed, they're not staying in Africa, right? Where are they going? They're going back home to China. So they are now going back to China after the work is complete, having been led to faith and discipled by Kenyans to share their faith back in China, a country that is, infamous for religious oppression. That's the kingdom at work. That's the tree we are talking about. It's the things that often don't make the news. It's the things we might not even see necessarily in church. But the kingdom is at work and it's growing. And I think that is reason for hope. It is reason for hope. The kingdom is expanding. Jesus told another parable. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. Leaven, or yeast would be another translation, that a woman took and mixed into 50 pounds of flour until all of it was leavened. Now, full confession, cooking and baking is not my forte. I've tried a few things in the past. I would think I would be good at it because I'm pretty good at following instructions. But I'm also very curious, so I like to try what if I just changed this or just added this ingredient? It usually doesn't go well. If you ask my wife, she will affirm that. So I say that to tell you that it took a little bit of research for me to understand what yeast actually does. I had to do some deep dives into the worlds of food blogging and whatnot. It's a jungle out there if you haven't. It's a whole culture. But here's what I discovered is that yeast is actually a living single-cell organism. I didn't know that. Yeast is actually alive. And so the brilliance of Jesus telling this parable, as we'll see in a minute, is that he's highlighting something that is so tiny. And you have to imagine with me, because I had a picture of it too. So tiny, it could sit on your fingertip, a little grain, and yet it's alive. And so these things on their own don't really seem that significant, right? Yeast, flour. But if you think about it, the flour, in order for a yeast to be worked into flour and worked into dough, that flour has to be soft. It has to be pliable. It has to be able to receive that yeast. This doesn't really work if it's just coarse grain or something hard. It has to be soft, just as a person's heart has to be soft, has to be receptive to receiving God's word. And it only takes a small amount of yeast. And once that yeast is mixed in, it starts this process called fermentation. And fermentation is actually a pretty interesting process. I would not have told you that a couple of weeks ago, but it turns out it actually is. It's extremely gradual. It doesn't really look like anything's happening until very late in its operation, and yet it has this cumulative exponential power to create and to transform. So I think you can see kind of where Jesus is going with this, the brilliance of using this analogy. One of the food bloggers I read said this. He said, a ferment, or yeast, generates its own energy from within. It not only seems alive, it is alive. It is alive. And as I continued reading, I noticed consistently there were three primary benefits of this process, this fermentation process with yeast. I'm going to share those with you. The three main benefits of this process are that it swells, it strengthens, and it seasons. And yes, I did grow up in a Baptist church, so I had to have some alliteration in there somewhere. So it swells, it strengthens, it seasons. The first one is it swells. It causes the dough to rise. I think when most of us think about what yeast does, that's the first thing that comes to mind, right? As we envision that bread baking, it causes dough to rise. So just as the dough rises, so a person grows in maturity. As the kingdom takes root in our hearts, a person grows in maturity, becoming more like Christ. It also strengthens. So it's not just getting bigger. What this does is during this fermentation process, the proteins and the molecules are actually being strengthened, just as our relationship with Christ and his church are being strengthened during this process. And the last thing that does is it seasons. it seasons, it causes reactions. There's all kinds of chemical reactions going on during this process with the enzymes and the different acids in the dough to bring out its natural flavor. To bring out its natural flavor. Just as the kingdom permeates our hearts and it works through our hearts, we begin to take on Christ's likeness, right? We start to carry this heavenly aroma, this heavenly sweetness or savoriness the more time we spend with Christ and the more the kingdom takes root. I think this is one of the reasons why I love spending time around those who have walked with God for decades and decades. One of things we love to do when my grandparents used to live over in Sebring in a retirement community for retired missionaries and pastors. And we love to just go over there with our kids and just spend time with these people who had walked with God for decades and decades and decades. And I don't think I have to tell you like how much we need that. I know having conversations here, and we're a young church, and we desire that. We need it. And you see these people that have walked with God. You see the seasoning on their life, right? Not just in age, but you see the seasoning of the kingdom and Christ's likeness in their life, right? There's a sweetness there. And so although our focus tends to be drawn solely to that first benefit, the rising and the growing, there is so much more that meets the eye going on during this process. And that's typically how the gospel works. That's how the gospel starts its work in our lives. Because God's grace is doing its work in our hearts. There's a lot we still have to learn. There's a lot of growing still to do, a lot of sanctification that still needs to happen, but you know that something has changed. Some kind of transformation has started happening. Even though it can't be fully known or fully explained, there's a mysteriousness there sometimes. But the growth is happening as the kingdom keeps inwardly permeating every facet of our lives, whether that's our beliefs, our thoughts, our affections, our motives, our actions. But I think if we're honest, this process is a lot of times a lot slower and more painful than we would prefer, right? Just as Jesus' listeners were probably thinking, okay, the kingdom is here, but what you're pointing to sounds like it's going to take an awful long time. Similar to the process of the kingdom permeating our hearts. Our desires for what? Being human. We want instant gratification, kind of like when I was doing lawn care. I wanted to see results right away. We want shortcuts. We want breakthroughs. We want, and here Jesus is emphasizing time and he's emphasizing patience. It's not a coincidence. He's using these two analogies, these two parables, one after another, that are both emphasizing time and patience. Paul Tripp has a term that he uses called tenderizing mercies. Tenderizing mercies. Our life group has been reading through his book on parenting, and that's one of the things he highlights is God's tenderizing mercies in us as parents. These are the things that soften our hearts. But if you think of the tenderizing process, we're just going to keep the food analogies going, okay? If you think of the tenderizing process, you've got this metal mallet and you've got a steak that needs to be tenderized. That thing you have to keep beating it and beating it and beating it right before you put that on the grill. It's not the most pleasant process usually. It can take time and it's often slow, it's often painful, and it's often very humbling, right? Just like adulting. Just like adulting, these tenderizing mercies, the things that soften our hearts, are the most valuable often. These are the things that God uses to keep that yeast penetrating. It's like the woman mixing the dough. But the beautiful thing is, as well, is that this fermentation process, this permeation of the kingdom in our hearts, it doesn't just stop with our lives. It doesn't just stop with my life. It doesn't just stop with your life. Because it then works through your life into the lives of others and through their lives and so on and so on. Just like we heard the story in the Kenyan Christians. It didn't just stop there. That's the beauty of the church. It's the beauty of this gathering, of this body, is how God uses the kingdom in our own hearts and to work through us into the lives of others. And then we see the kingdom externally expanding. And so the kingdom continues to grow, to slowly grow, to permeate throughout the world, not just outwardly like the mustard seed in the tree, but we see it permeating inwardly as well in our own hearts. And you might be saying, again, okay, that sounds great. I see the story, the first story. I see the external, the kingdom expanding. That's great. And I see the second parable about how the kingdom permeates and expands inwardly. And that's great too, but I just don't see this happening. Why can't I see it? And I think that's a pretty common conception right now, especially as we look at the world around us and we ask, where is the kingdom? Or we ask, okay, that's a great story, but what about now? What about where we are now? Or what about what I'm experiencing now? So I want to read you just a brief description and see if this is something we all relate to. And you let me know if I've more or less summed it up. The world is in conflict. Within the church, there is disunity between members. There are tensions between rich and poor, power struggles even among Christian leaders. Outside the church, believers encounter an increasingly hostile culture and political structure. There is no one inside the church or outside of it who has not been impacted by a raging epidemic that has killed innumerable people. Some Christians are disheartened and losing hope. Others, having received unjust treatment by their non-Christian neighbors, want revenge against people who have tormented them. The world seems out of control. Does that sound about right? The funny thing is, I didn't write that. That was actually written by a church historian. And what we're looking at, what I'm describing here, actually took place in the year 250, AD 250. The church was barely over a couple hundred years old at this point. And yet here they are facing political tension. They're facing tension inside. They're facing a pandemic. They're seeing injustice on the streets. The world seems out of control. And it's hard to ignore the parallels, right? 2,000 years ago. Because we look around us and we see the similar things. We see COVID, we see political turmoil, we see racial injustice. And I think the temptation is to look at that and say, man, how are we going to get through this? How is the kingdom going to keep growing? It feels like hope is lost. It feels like we just need to circle the wagons, hunker down, go live in a commune somewhere and try to ride this thing out until Jesus returns, right? And there actually are people that are proponents of that. I'm not just making that up. We have all these enemies of hope. We live in a time where there are enemies of hope, and so it's easy to ask, where is the kingdom in the middle of this? Where is the kingdom? And yet, I read that story, and I take hope from that. I read that account, and I take hope from that because I see 2,000 years ago what the church was facing, and I see after 2,000 years what the kingdom has become. And I think if we look around, if we ask God to open our eyes, we're going to see that more and more and more. So often we define the kingdom the wrong way. I think a lot of our discouragement and our lack of hope comes in how we see what the kingdom is or how we see ourselves. So what is the kingdom? It's something I didn't want to start off right away with a definition because I think sometimes it's helpful just to read the text and try to put ourselves in the shoes of Jesus' listeners who were hearing about this for the first time. There were echoes of the kingdom in the Old Testament, but Jesus coming and sharing about the kingdom, this is the first time it's really been talked about. But as we look at Jesus' these two parables and his other teachings throughout the Gospels and the New Testament, the kingdom can be summed up very simply. And the kingdom of heaven is essentially the redemptive rule or reign of God in Christ. The redemptive rule or reign of God in Christ. And as we've seen in these two parables, it's a present reality. The kingdom is here. The kingdom is advancing. It's present. But it's also this future realization, right? Which is where we find ourselves now. We know and we believe the king is coming back. The king is coming back. And there is going to be a culmination. There's going to be a completion of all this. His kingdom will one day be complete. But right now, we are living between the already and the not yet. It's a very difficult place to be. And I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting that as believers. And so, as we're looking at what the kingdom is and our ability to identify it, as I said, I think one of the important things to recognize is how we view the kingdom in the first place. How do we view it? I think our tendency is to measure the strength of the kingdom by two primary things: political power and cultural influence. Political power and cultural influence. So I think we see a lot of the hand-wringing that's going on about the kingdom failing or diminishing, or where is Jesus, or Jesus must be coming back tomorrow because otherwise I don't know what we're going to do. And yet we've seen throughout history the church at its strongest, when it flourishes the most, are when these two things are not in its favor. When the church flourishes and grows the most, or when it's under oppression, it's under persecution, or when it is countercultural to the mainstream culture. When you look at the history of the early church, what was it that drew people to this early body of believers? It wasn't that they had this amazing evangelistic program. It wasn't that they had all these structures in place for going out to neighborhoods, and they didn't have virtual church or anything like that. What drew people to the church was they were different. People were curious. They were drawn to this body of believers that showed love to one another, and people were curious about that. But it took time. It was part of this fermentation process, this patient process of the early church. And so that's a couple of the ways we tend to want to measure the kingdom, or maybe we want the benefits of and the assurances of the kingdom without the costs or the commitments or the restraints that come with it. I think this is especially true in the age that we find ourselves in. I think Mark Sayers says it very succinctly, and he says, we want the kingdom without the king. We want the kingdom without the king. I think the world at large recognizes the benefits of Scripture, recognizes the benefits of Jesus' teaching. The world has not been the same since Jesus came and since the church started to spread. And yet we live in an age now where we want this buffet-style Christianity, this buffet-style faith where my truth is what's paramount. My truth should define what I believe and what is actually true. We want the kingdom, we want the benefits of the kingdom, but we don't want an authority figure over top of us telling us what to do. The problem with that is that a kingdom is only as good as its king. A kingdom is only as good as its king. I mean, we've seen this play out countless times over history. How often in Israel's history did they put their faith and their trust in the man on the throne rather than in God? And as the leader went, so went the people. And not just in Israel. I mean, we've seen this countless times. And so here we see Jesus promising the fulfillment eventually of this kingdom, but it's not our kingdom, it's his. He invites us to be a part of this. But the king is going to be coming back. The king is going to be ruling his kingdom. So that's a little bit about how we view the kingdom is important to understand, but also how we view ourselves. And we talked a little bit earlier about the stories that we tell ourselves and how we view everything through the lens of story. And I think one of the things that stories promise us, whether we recognize it or not, but one of the reasons we gravitate towards them too is we're looking for certainty. We're looking for certainty. So we might believe a story because in our past, X and Y and Z happened to us. And because of that, the story I'm telling myself is, I know if this happens and I recognize the patterns, then this is going to happen. We want certainty from the stories that we tell ourselves. And we find it very difficult to live without certainty that certain narratives promise. And the thing is, whether they're true or false, a lot of times is secondary, right? Whether they're true or false can be secondary. And then we tend to surround ourselves with other people who will affirm that same narrative, who are going to affirm that same stories, so that we aren't challenged by truth. But we crave certainty, especially in uncertain times. And so the amazing thing that Jesus is doing as he's coming is he's offering us not just a story, but he's also offering us certainty and truth. Because the author himself, the author of this story himself, is the Word, and he is the truth. So let's be clear on one thing as we move forward here, is that we are not the ones building the kingdom. I think sometimes we can get into that mindset, and it either can make us feel really good about ourselves, or on off days make us feel really defeated, because it feels like that burden is on us to build that kingdom. Only God can build his kingdom. Only God, only the King can build his kingdom. But we are not bystanders. We are not bystanders. Rich Velotis clarified this, and I like what he says here. He says, we, as it concerns the kingdom, we announce it, we seek it, we receive it, and we bear witness to it, and we build for it. But only God can do the building. Only God can provide the actual growth. Around that period of time that I just read that account in the early church, a man named Cyprian, who was a bishop in North Africa, lived through this period of time that I described. And he wrote to his people, to the church, to offer them hope. This is what he said. He said, "Beloved brethren, we are philosophers, not in words, but in deeds. We exhibit our wisdom not by our dress, but by truth. We know virtues by their practice, rather than through boasting of them. We do not speak great things, but we live them." We are not bystanders in the kingdom. We do not speak great things, but we live them. What does that mean? Well, if you look at the Greek word for church, ecclesia is the Greek word for church. What does that translate to? Well, literally it means called out. Called out. We are a community of calling. We're a community of the called. As the body of Christ, as part of the kingdom, we are called out. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15:58. He says, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the Lord's work, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." Your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Now, this verse is coming on the heels of Paul finishing writing about the resurrection. So he's recapping Christ's resurrection, and then he's telling the church about what we have to look forward to, our eternal hope, our future resurrection in Christ. So how would you, if you were Paul, how would you be wrapping up that chapter? I think if it was me, I might say something like, well, since you have this great hope, take a seat, put your feet up, grab a cup of coffee because God's coming back. He's got you. There's nothing to worry about, right? But instead, what does he finish with? He finishes with a challenge. He says, because we have this hope, it's not cause to sit back and relax and just let the world pass us by and bemoan the fact that everything's falling apart and I'm just waiting for Jesus to return. He finishes by telling us to continue our work, excelling in our work, knowing that our labor in the Lord is not in vain. I think another way we could put that is know that your adulting is not in vain. Know that your parenting is not in vain. Whatever you put in the blank, doing it unto the Lord, it is not in vain. I'm just about finished, but I want to close with a quote for you. I thought this was so powerful as we think about building for God's kingdom and our role in that. This really encouraged me. So N.T. Wright says this. He says, what you do in the present, by painting, preaching, singing, sewing, praying, teaching, building hospitals, digging wells, campaigning for justice, writing poems, caring for the needy, loving your neighbor as yourself. What you do in the present will last into God's future. These activities are not simply ways of making the present life a little less beastly. He's British, so he uses words like beastly. A little less beastly or a little more bearable until the day when we leave it behind. They are part of what we may call building for God's kingdom. By such labors, you are not oiling the wheels of a machine that's about to roll over a cliff. You are not restoring a great painting that's shortly going to be thrown into the fire. You are not planting roses in a garden that's about to be dug up for a building site. You are, strange though it may seem, accomplishing something that will become, in due course, part of God's new world. What you do in the Lord is not in vain. Would you all please join me in standing? I'll invite worship team